to the wonderfully confusing world of reflexive verbs. Now, as an intermediate student, you've probably already been using a bunch of these verbs quite a lot, and you probably aren't having too many issues using them. But you also maybe have some questions, like for example, how do I know when a reflexive verb is really needed? Where do I place those pronouns in more complex structures? And what do I need to know to fully master reflexive verbs? In this video, I'm going to answer all these very important questions. So as we get started here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get new videos just like this twice every week. So let's get started by reviewing what you remember about reflexive verbs. So what are reflexive verbs? Well, the simplest explanation I can give you is that reflexive verbs are directed back to the subject. They reflect upon the subject. Their verb conjugations, together with the pronoun, the reflexive pronouns, always coordinate with the subject of the sentence. So it's that subject that you really need to think about. Like the first example we have here. Me desperté a las 8. Me desperté a las 8. I woke up at 8. So the subject here is, of course, I, and the reflexive verb despertarse, meaning to wake oneself up, is conjugated in the first person form yo. So yo me desperté. So what about other reflexive verbs? Well, despertarse is a verb of routine, and that's one of the most commonly used groups of verbs. But there are actually a couple more categories of verbs that can help us remember when to use the reflexive pronoun. So we also have reflexive verbs of emotion. Te aburrirías, which means you'd get bored. You also have verbs of motion or movement. Se va mañana. He leaves tomorrow. Verbs that are generally always reflexive. Se quejaban mucho. They complained a lot. And then finally we have a category of verb that is only used in the plural, so nosotros, vosotros, or ustedes, and it's used for situations where you're doing something together, with someone, or to each other. And these are called reciprocal verbs. So for example, nos encontramos ayer. We met up yesterday. Now, one useful way to think about these kind of verbs is that in Spanish they're often a lot more literal than in English. So for example, when you say in Spanish encontrarse, which literally means to find each other, what we really say in English is to meet up. And aburrirse, which literally means to bore oneself, in English we say something like, oh, I get bored. So whereas in Spanish it's often quite literal the way we use these verbs, in English there's often an idiomatic expression that we use instead, so they don't always translate perfectly. So when is a reflexive verb really needed? If we go back to our initial example with despertarse, we can see why and how. Me desperté a las 8. In this case, the verb is directed back to the subject, which is me. So it's like we're saying, I wake, in brackets, myself up. I wake up at 8 o'clock. Instead, if you say this, desperté a los niños a las 8. Now here we're saying I wake the kids up at 8. So I'm not directing the action towards myself, but I'm doing it to somebody else, the kids in this case. Another reason we need a reflexive verb is when we really do mean to say that particular expression in English that doesn't exist directly in Spanish. Like, for example, get bored. Te aburrirías con las clases. In this case, the verb of emotion, aburrirse, reflects on the subject. You'd get bored with these classes. The emotion, the boredom is internalized. On the other hand, if you say, la clase te aburriría, this directs the action to you, and in this case, what's the subject? Well, it's not you, it's the class. The class would bore you. The class does the action to you. The class makes you bored. It's not something that you're doing to yourself. And that's why in this example, we don't need the reflexive pronoun. So, is that clear? Now, what about those tricky pronouns then? Do they always go before the verb? Well, we have two options for pronoun placement with these reflexive verbs. Option 1 is exactly the placement that we've been seeing so far. So here are some examples with some different reflexive verbs in different moods and tenses using option 1. Quiero que te diviertas. I want you to have fun. Se están quedando aquí. They are staying here. Ya me había mudado. I had already moved. No te preocupes. Don't worry. Nos vamos a casar. We're going to get married. Did you see how in all these cases the reflexive pronoun is separate from the verb? It's like another word. Option 2, however, is a bit different, and we can actually tack the reflexive pronoun onto the end of the verb. For example, instead of saying se están quedando aquí, we could say están quedándose aquí. Or instead of saying nos vamos a casar, you could say vamos a casarnos. What's important to note is that you can only do this, tacking on the pronoun onto the end of the verb, with the progressive tense, quedando, or with infinitives, casar. So, with both these infinitives and the progressive tense, we can use both option 1 or option 2. For conversation, it's actually often easier to use option 1 because it gives you time to think about what pronoun you should use at the end, which is quite a handy little trick. Están quedándose aquí. Now, be careful with commands. If you're giving commands, you can only use option 2. For example, cálmate, calm down. Cuídense, take care. Sentémonos, let's sit down. Bueno, espero que te haya gustado este video. I hope this has been a fun review of the reflexives and some important reminders as to when, how and why reflexives are used. I hope you enjoyed this grammar lesson. Now, to download the full notes for this lesson, please click the link in the video description below, and that will take you to a page where you can sign up for our Spanish Vault and get free access to that and lots of other stuff. Now, if you'd like to test yourself on this grammar point, then check out the next video where we have a little quiz prepared for you. Otherwise, please subscribe to the channel y nos vemos en el próximo.